The backstage coordinator had been in the music business for 22 years. She had managed nervous first-timers, calmed down rock stars mid-meltdown, and once talked a Grammy winner out of walking off stage entirely. But she had never, not once, faced a problem like this one. It was 8:47 p.m. The show started in 13 minutes, and both women were ready. That was the problem. The date was February 22, 1989. The venue was the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. Outside, 3,000 people had filled every seat. Camera crews from 3 different networks were setting up their shots. The red carpet had already closed. The show was moments away from beginning. And backstage, in a corridor that smelled of hairspray and fresh flowers, a woman named Carol Simmons stood between 2 dressing room doors and tried very hard to look calm. Carol had been hired 6 months earlier specifically to coordinate the talent for this evening. She had a clipboard. She had a headset. She had a schedule that had been approved by 4 different managers, 2 record label executives, and 1 entertainment attorney. That schedule said Tina Turner would perform at 9:15 p.m. It said Whitney Houston would perform at 10:30 p.m. What the schedule did not account for, what no schedule could have accounted for, was that both women had arrived early. Both women had finished their preparations early. And both women had, within the same 10-minute window, sent their respective assistants into the hallway to ask the same question. Is there any chance we could move our slot? Carol had been doing this job long enough to understand what that question really meant. It did not mean either woman wanted a different time. It meant each of them had heard the other was there. And each of them, in her own way, was dealing with that information. Tina Turner was 50 years old that night. She had been performing professionally for nearly 3 decades. She had survived things that would have ended most careers before they began. Years of abuse, a public divorce that played out in newspapers across the country, a period in the mid-1970s when she had essentially nothing, performing in small clubs for small crowds just to keep moving. And then, against every reasonable expectation, she had come back. Not quietly, not modestly. She had come back with Private Dancer in 1984 and reminded the entire music industry that they had made a significant error in writing her off. By 1989, Tina Turner was not simply a successful artist, she was a symbol. She was proof of something. Every person in that auditorium who had ever been told they were finished, who had ever been left behind, who had ever had to rebuild from nothing, they saw themselves in her. That was not something you could manufacture. That was something you earned, slowly, over decades, at great personal cost. Whitney Houston was 25 years old that night. She had been famous for 4 years, and in those 4 years, she had done something that almost no one does. She had lived up to the hype. Her debut album had produced 3 #1 singles. The follow-up had produced more. She sang with a precision and an emotional clarity that made other singers stop what they were doing and pay attention. Critics who had spent years being cynical about the music industry found themselves writing things they hadn't expected to write. That this was genuine, that this was rare, that this was someone who came along perhaps once in a generation. Whitney Houston had not yet experienced the things that would come later. She was, in that moment, at the beginning of something that seemed like it might be limitless. 2 women, 50 feet of hallway between their dressing rooms, and 13 minutes. Before she knocked on either door, Carol stood in that hallway for a full minute and thought about what she was about to do. She had handled difficult talent her entire career. She had delivered bad news to people who did not receive bad news gracefully. She had rearranged schedules at the last minute, managed ego conflicts, mediated disputes over dressing room sizes and catering orders and billing positions on promotional materials. She was good at her job precisely because she had learned, over many years and many uncomfortable conversations, that the way you approached a difficult moment almost always determined how it ended. Walk in with your clipboard leading, treating the conversation like a logistics problem, and you got a logistics response. Territorial, transactional, somebody wins and somebody loses. Walk in with something else, something harder to define but easier to recognize, and sometimes you got a different kind of answer entirely. Carol straightened her jacket. She took a breath. Then she knocked on Tina's door first. Not because the schedule said to, but because in her 22 years of experience, she had developed a sense for which conversations needed to happen in which order. And something told her that this one needed to start here. Tina Turner opened the door herself. She was already in costume. The short dress, the heels, the hair that had become as recognizable as her voice. She looked at Carol the way a person looks at someone who is about to deliver news they already suspect. Carol explained the situation simply. Both artists were ready. The schedule had them performing at different times, but there was flexibility, and she wanted to make sure both women were comfortable with how the evening was arranged. Tina listened. She didn't interrupt. When Carol finished, there was a pause that lasted long enough to feel significant. Then Tina Turner said something that Carol would repeat for the rest of her career, at dinner parties and in interviews, and in a memoir she published many years later. She said, "Go ask her what she wants, and whatever she says, that's fine with me." Carol walked 50 feet down the hallway and knocked on Whitney Houston's door. Whitney's assistant opened it. Inside, Whitney was standing in front of a mirror, not looking at her reflection, but looking at something past it, somewhere in the middle distance, the way performers sometimes do when they are gathering themselves. She turned when she heard Carol come in, and Carol noticed, she mentioned this in the memoir, that Whitney's hands were very still. Not the stillness of someone who is calm, the stillness of someone who has made a deliberate decision to appear calm. Carol delivered the same explanation she had given Tina. Both artists were ready, there was flexibility. What did Whitney prefer? Whitney Houston looked at Carol for a moment. Then she asked one question. She asked, "Is she nervous?" Carol didn't know how to answer that. She had just spent 3 minutes with Tina Turner, and nervous was not a word that would have occurred to her. She said something careful and non-committal, the way people do when they don't want to get the answer wrong. Whitney nodded slowly, and then she said, "Tell her I'll go first." What Carol didn't know in that moment, what she wouldn't understand until she read an interview Whitney gave several years later, was that the question had not been rhetorical. Whitney genuinely wanted to know. Not because she was looking for vulnerability to exploit, not because she was trying to level the playing field in some psychological way, but because she needed to know that the woman she had watched from a living room floor in New Jersey was still human. Still someone who felt the weight of a stage before she stepped onto it. Because of Tina Turner, who had survived everything, who had rebuilt everything, who had stood in front of crowds for 3 decades and given them everything she had. If she still felt something before walking out into the lights, then the feeling Whitney had right now, that particular mixture of exhilaration and terror that she could never quite explain to people who hadn't experienced it, meant something. It wasn't weakness. It was the price of caring. It was what happened when something mattered enough. There was a particular reason Whitney said this, and it was not modesty, and it was not strategy. It was something closer to reverence. Whitney Houston had grown up watching Tina Turner. Not in the abstract, general way that people say they grew up watching someone. She meant it literally. She had been 9 years old the first time she saw Tina perform on television, and she had sat on the floor in her mother's living room in New Jersey and felt something shift inside her, some understanding of what it meant to commit fully to a moment, to give an audience not just your voice, but your entire body, your entire history, everything you had ever survived and everything you had ever hoped for, all of it, simultaneously, without holding anything back. Whitney had spent the next 16 years learning how to do that. She wasn't sure she had learned it yet. She wasn't sure anyone could fully learn it. But she knew who had taught her to try. Going first was not about conceding anything. It was about sequence. It was Whitney saying, without words, "You close the evening, because that is where you belong." Carol relayed the message. She walked back down the hallway and knocked on Tina's door again. When she told Tina what Whitney had said, Tina didn't respond immediately. She looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked up at Carol and said, "She didn't have to do that." Carol said she knew. Tina said, "Make sure someone tells her I know." At 9:02 p.m., 13 minutes ahead of the original schedule, Whitney Houston walked out of her dressing room and toward the stage. She was wearing a white gown. Her hair was pulled back. She moved the way she always moved, with that particular combination of grace and intention that made people in her vicinity instinctively stop what they were doing and watch. In the wings, before she went on, she paused. Carol was standing nearby. Whitney didn't say anything to her. But Carol said later that she saw Whitney close her eyes for about 3 seconds. And she saw her lips move, very slightly, though no sound came out. Then Whitney Houston walked onto the stage at the Shrine Auditorium, and 3,000 people rose to their feet before she had sung a single note. What happened over the next 24 minutes has been described many times by many people who were there. The reviews the next morning used words like transcendent and otherworldly and historic. One critic wrote that it was the finest single performance he had witnessed in 19 years of covering live music. The musicians in the pit later said that there were moments when they forgot to watch their sheet music because they were watching her instead. A camera operator from one of the network crews said he had to remind himself to keep the camera steady because his hands had started to shake. Whitney Houston sang that night with something extra in her. Everyone who was there felt it. It was not simply technical excellence, the range, the control, the phrasing that could make a single held note feel like a complete emotional statement. It was something underneath all of that, an urgency, a desire to be worthy of the person waiting in the wings. When she finished, she stood at the front of the stage for a moment, breathing. The applause came up around her like a physical thing. She looked out at the audience, and then, just for a second, she looked to the side, toward the wings, toward the darkness where she knew someone was standing. She walked off the stage. Tina Turner was waiting. The two women stood facing each other in the dim light of the wings, and the noise from the audience was still rolling through the building, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then, Tina Turner reached out and took both of Whitney's hands in hers. And she looked at her, really looked at her. The way you look at someone when you want them to understand that you are not just being polite. And she said, "That's the only way to do it." Whitney Houston said later, in an interview she gave several years after that night, that those 5 words meant more to her than any review she had ever received. She said she had spent her whole career trying to understand what it meant to give everything, and that night, for the first time, she felt like she had gotten close to it. And she said that having the one person she most respected in the world confirm that, not with enthusiasm, not with flattery, but with that quiet, certain 5-word sentence, was something she could not fully explain. She said she cried later, in the car, on the way home. Not sad crying, the other kind. Tina Turner performed at 10:30 p.m. that night, as the schedule had originally planned. She was on stage for 31 minutes. What she did in those 31 minutes is also well documented, also described in the reviews as historic, also something that people who were there still talk about when they talk about the greatest live performances they have ever witnessed. But the part of that evening that the people who were there remember most vividly is not the performances. It is the moment before and the moment after. It is the image of a coordinator standing in a hallway between 2 closed doors, trying to solve a problem that turned out not to be a problem at all. It is the question Whitney asked, is she nervous? And what that question revealed about how much she understood the weight of the night. It is the message Tina sent back. Make sure someone tells her I know. It is 2 women, in the wings, hands held, 5 words. Carol Simmons retired from the music industry in 2004. In the acknowledgments of her memoir, published in 2011, she wrote that in 22 years of working with some of the most extraordinary performers in the world, she had witnessed many things she would never forget. But that one night at the Shrine Auditorium had given her something she carried differently than all the rest. Not as a memory, exactly, more like a standard. A reminder of what it looked like when 2 people, instead of competing, chose to honor each other. She wrote that she thought about it whenever she was in a situation that felt like it might become adversarial, whenever she felt the pull toward protecting her own position at the expense of someone else. She wrote that she thought about a hallway and 2 closed doors and a woman who said, "Whatever she wants is fine with me." There is a photograph from that evening. It was taken in the wings, just after Whitney came off stage, in the moment before Tina took her hands. The photograph is slightly out of focus. The photographer was not expecting the moment, was not positioned for it, grabbed the shot on instinct. In the photograph, Whitney's back is to the camera. Tina is facing toward it, but not looking at it. She is looking at Whitney. Her expression is not one of those large, performed expressions that exist to be photographed. It is small and private and completely unguarded. It is the expression of someone who recognizes something. The photograph has been printed in dozens of books and magazines over the years. It appears on the covers of two separate retrospective collections. People who study it tend to focus on different things: the lighting, the posture, the way the darkness of the wings frames the two figures. But what Carol Simmons said, when someone showed it to her for the first time, was that it didn't capture the most important part. It didn't capture the sound. The audience still going, out there beyond the curtain. The music still in the air. The 31 minutes that were about to begin. It didn't capture what it felt like to be in that hallway, on that night, and understand, without anyone having to say it, that you were watching something that only happens once. Some things in the music industry get remembered because they were recorded. Because a camera was in the right place, or a journalist was taking notes, or a producer happened to be rolling tape. And some things get remembered for a different reason entirely. Because the people who were there carried them differently. Because the moment asked something of them, and they rose to it. And that rising left a mark that no recording could capture, and no review could fully describe. The hallway at the Shrine Auditorium on February 22, 1989, was that second kind of thing. Carol knew it that night. She carried it for the rest of her life. And so, in their own ways, did the two women who stood in the wings and held each other's hands while the applause was still going.